You know, people in Europe call these games shmups. What's their problem? This is PlayStation, Year 1. Strangely enough, I think Raiden's popularity is tied directly to the way it was originally distributed in North America. Raiden was published stateside by a company named FabTech, an arcade cabinet distributor who had an unusually keen eye for quality games from lesser-known Japanese developers at the time. FabTech produced North American versions of games like TAD Corporation's platformer Toki and the trackball-controlled shooter Cabal, along with a handful of other games throughout the late 80s and early 90s. I remember games like Toki and Cabal showing up at convenience stores, gas stations, and laundromats much more often than in dedicated video arcades, at least here in the American South anyway. I suspect that FabTech focused on distributing its games via less traditional channels like arcade cabinet rental services, earning their games a sort of niche appeal back in the day. FabTech had an established relationship with developer Seibu Kaihatsu, having previously published North American versions of their games Dynamite Duke and Dead Angle. Raiden was the third game produced in this collaboration between Seibu and FabTech. I'd assume it was a pretty big success for both companies, given by just how often I saw it in the stores around my neighborhood when I was a kid. FabTech's distribution muscle must have played a role in Raiden's success, because gameplay-wise, it offered little that hadn't been seen before in arcade shoot-'em-ups. Gameplay is inspired by contemporary shooters developed by Japanese studio Toaplan. In particular, it borrows thematic elements and gameplay concepts from Toaplan's Twin Hawk and Fire Shark, both of which were released a year earlier in 1989. These games focus on encounters with ground-based enemy targets, a key feature that made Raiden much more mechanically interesting than the carbon copy spaceship shooters that dominated the 1980s. Whether it's because of its weirdo gas station mystique or its quality gameplay, Raiden was an established hit, and a sequel arrived in 1993. Unlike the original Raiden, though, Raiden 2 was never ported to 16-bit consoles at the time. Considering the popularity of the series and the lack of arcade-perfect ports of either game, it made sense for Sony to launch a compilation with the PlayStation in North America in 1995. That's the Raiden Project, a straightforward port of Raiden 1 and 2 that offers little in the way of extra content, aside from optional remix soundtracks and some added presentation options. It's pretty bare bones compared to later retro compilations like the Namco Museum series, but it gets the job done. This wouldn't be the last time Sony would lead off a console launch with a retro shoot-'em-up compilation, either. Konami released the shooter Twin Pack Gradius 3 and 4 shortly after the North American launch of the PlayStation 2 in 2000. The Raiden Project and Gradius 3 and 4 both targeted a hardcore player base with well-designed ports of arcade shoot-'em-ups that didn't receive entirely accurate or complete home ports during the previous console generation. I seem to remember both games being poorly received at release, too. Critics at the time dismissed both games for sticking to established formulas instead of using the raw power of the PlayStation, or PS2, to show off their 3D capabilities. Some outlets even gave the collections low review scores, despite the fact that they both offer competent ports of worthwhile arcade shoot-'em-ups. It's a pretty good demonstration of how expectations and hype can skew popular opinion regarding console launch titles, in spite of their objective quality. This is also why it helps to look back on these kind of things with an eye for history, since it lets you better appreciate games within a more informed context. Personally, I didn't think much of the Raiden Project after its release in 1995, but I appreciate its existence much more nowadays, especially considering that Raiden 2 was impossible to emulate up until recently. Raiden was such a popular arcade game that it was frequently pirated, leading Seibu to heavily encrypt the program data for the sequel. As a result, the PC arcade emulator MAME could easily reproduce a perfect version of the original Raiden, but the sequel was not emulated until late in 2014. At one time, the Raiden Project was one of your very few options if you wanted to play Raiden 2 outside of an arcade. Of the 10 launch titles for the original PlayStation in North America, the Raiden Project was one of the most historically significant. It tied a pair of well-known and highly regarded arcade games to new console hardware, effectively bridging the gap between the 16-bit and 32-bit eras. Thank you for watching. We'll stick to shoot-'em-ups in the next episode with Total Eclipse Turbo, a conversion of a 3DO rail shooter developed by Crystal Dynamics. See you then.